structure of the report of original research, or the formal study. And what I do is I make this funnel shape to emphasize, here we have objectives, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. Make this funnel shape to emphasize that anything you're going to ultimately forward as a conclusion has got to be accounted in the different sections of the study. And again, this is an example of how the editorial structure can help you with your scientific reasoning in coming to a conclusion, to help you make a better case for that conclusion to the reader. So the idea is that because of this problem that exists, I'll just say background. The introduction would include a paragraph or two of background and then the objective statements. Now, that's in say a clinical journal. In some other journals, we have many paragraph introduction or background, sometimes with 20 or 30 citations and references, really a whole literature review before we get to the objective statement. What I'm saying here is that if you're going to, for instance, write for Journal X and it has a 10-paragraph introduction section, then you're best advised to follow that general model. If you're going to write for a more clinical journal where it has only 2 or 3 paragraphs at most introduction, then you write in that style. But the idea being is that based on this background, an author would make an objective statement, the objective of the study. And I see objective statements being essentially written in 2 ways. I see directly stated objectives, and I see indirectly stated objective. Which is better? It would make sense, a lot of sense, that a directly stated objective is better. Now this is, again, take this with a grain of salt, because some fields of research you can only get so direct in the objective statement. Some areas of inquiry have research questions. And so again, you have to follow the conventions of that field. There are 3 surefire ways to state an objective directly. One is to use the word objective. Our objective is whatever it is, and then by the time I get to the conclusions, it would make sense that that objective would have been achieved and the conclusion made. Another one is to have an hypothesis, or better yet, use it as a verb. We hypothesize that, and then by the end of the study, I would expect that hypothesis to be confirmed or refuted. And then another way to state it objectively is to put it in the form of a question, which by the end of the study, you would have an answer to that question. So again, the format, the style that you choose varies based on the purpose, the type of research, the field. The objective statement itself in a well-written piece would appear in a place of emphasis in that 2 or 3 paragraphs. So what I typically see is it appears either as the first sentence of the 2nd or 3rd paragraph, or sometimes it appears as the last sentence of the 2nd or 3rd paragraph in one of those clinical type of journals. Now, based on that objective, you design methods. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to go into depth about methods. This is something you learn from your classes, but it makes sense. 2 things that are worth repeating that I've heard over the years. One comes by way of Brian Gibler of the Annals of Emergency Medicine, who suggested that authors, before they review the world literature and looked at how everyone else has approached the problem, his suggestion was that you try to come up with your own novel methods. The idea being, you don't want to bias yourself against your novel idea just because you're so familiar with how everyone else has looked at it. The other point worth repeating came to me by way of a biostatistician at the University of Puerto Rico. And during one of the breaks, she came up to me and told me about her job, which was to review people's statistics especially, and in the method section. And the problem was, is that people were sending her manuscripts to review after they had collected all the results and made their conclusions. And it was too late to integrate any of her points. And the way she put it, she said, I'm awful about it, but she says, you don't take the patient to the emergency room after he's already dead. The idea being, you can't change your methods after you started to collect your results. So that's the point there is, get feedback on your methods and the statistics and anything you're not fully confident in to make sure that they're as solid as possible before moving on to that next stage of doing that study. So based on those methods then, you would get some results. What do you like looking at better when you read scientific articles, medical articles? Do you like reading the sentences and paragraphs, or do you like looking at the figures and the tables? We like figures and tables, right? So by all means, results, if they're better conveyed in figures and tables, then by all means take advantage of that. You'd want to make maximum use of often they have a limit to how many tables or figures you can send to accompanying the manuscript. Based on the results then, you go through the test of a discussion section. Now, discussion sections vary most among journals, and in fact, they vary most even among the articles within a given journal. First point to make, however, is the discussion section is the only section in which you're free to speculate as to the causes of things. That's part of the role of the discussion section, is to test out different ideas and to discuss. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explode the discussion section here on the right-hand side because, again, they vary so much. So this, in the discussion section especially, is a place where you might deconstruct a discussion section, make an outline based on that, and use it to inform your writing. In fact, what I say to the faculty at the College of Medicine here, 1,100 faculty, they can all send me their manuscripts. What I say to them is, if you want me to do a really good job, send me, along with not only your manuscripts, but send me a PDF of an article that appeared in that journal sometime in the last 3 years. And so what I do is I put them both on the screens there, and I look to that model article to see how I can make the manuscript fit better the way that they do it at that journal. I think about it because in one small example, the discussion section in the paper that had been published, I noticed, had 3 subsections. And in the manuscript I was editing, it was just 5 or 6 paragraphs. So that was an easy suggestion. I just took exactly those same 3 subheadings that were under discussion, and I found the appropriate place in the manuscript. I might have had to move a whole paragraph around or 2, but the idea is that we use those exact same subheadings in that discussion as well. We used an editorial approved format to convey that information. What I'm going to go through here, the order I'm going to propose here as a means to help you think about the discussion section, I get from another great book on scientific writing, Edward Huth, called How to Write and Publish Papers in the Medical Sciences. This essentially is, I think, chapter 4, Argument, Structure, and Reasoning in a Scientific Manuscript. It makes sense, and I see most often that readers start their discussion section by reviewing their main finding, the main result that they got. Huth suggests that authors start with a working conclusion. I was confused at first because I thought the conclusion came after at the bottom, and it does, but he's talking about the working conclusion, the conclusion based on this study alone. What the discussion section does is it considers the rest of the body of literature in that area and makes a case for how this work adds to the rest of the body of knowledge in that area. So it does it in 3 ways, tests the working conclusion in 3 main ways. It tests it as far as how it fits in literature, a literature review. In 1994, I drove across town in New Haven to the Yale AIDS series, and I listened to a bunch of different speakers, and one of them was Bill Blattner, epidemiology editor at the Journal of AIDS, who was talking about electronic publishing. And he talked about the body of scientific knowledge is like a jigsaw puzzle that grows from the inside out. A group of authors published a new study. It's like adding a piece to that puzzle. And like a jigsaw puzzle, it's got to fit the nooks and crannies of what came before it. It's going to suggest the next step in that line of discovery. So I give you this analogy here to emphasize the role of the literature review in the discussion section. In it, you are making a case for how your work adds to the body of knowledge in that area. You test that working conclusion and its role in the literature, in particular, by paying close attention to the counter evidence, is the way Huth puts it. But the studies that do not agree with what you found, and then explain, offer possible reasons for that. And then you also test that work conclusion by acknowledging the limitations of the work. If you don't acknowledge the limitations, who will? Whose job is it to find out the weaknesses of a paper? When you submit to a journal, it goes to oftentimes 2 reviewers, and it's the reviewer's job to find out, to judge the strengths, relative limitations of that work. You can often head off some reviewers' comments at the turn by acknowledging those limitations, and frankly, most articles that I edit, they respond to them. So they often include not only a limitations section, but a strengths of the study. Strengths and limitations. So based on the test of this discussion section, then you would forward a conclusion. And the conclusion differs from this working conclusion here, in that this conclusion at the end of the paper is the conclusion about the issue itself. In other words, not only about this study alone, but the rest of the literature in that general topic. That's Huth's perspective. Your analysis of journals and your deconstructing of journals might give you, you might see a different role. In all honesty, lots of journal articles, the main conclusion is really just about this study itself and doesn't incorporate the rest of the literature. But I'm giving you the Huth's perspective. Thinking about how this flow of information works down in this cone shape, this funnel shape. Not being a scientist, I had to figure out a way to analyze this without all that scientific background, from, again, the editor's perspective. And what I figured out is that if you worked backwards through this, it was more easy to identify the gaps in the reasoning. So what I would do, and this, when I started looking into it, like I mentioned, it was 93, 95. This is when you printed out something and the page was still attached, and so I'd have a long string of paper on the floor, and I'd take different colored markers and identify different sections. But ultimately what I do is I number the conclusions. Maybe there's 2, maybe there's 1, maybe there's 3. And I look backwards and I make sure that I can find, based on a given conclusion, where the authors dealt with it in literature review and the counter evidence and limitations. And then I like to go and I like to look into the results section and make sure I can find a result that would lead some logical person to that conclusion. And then I would go into the method section to make sure that the method was reported to get that result, to get that conclusion. And then I want to go all the way back to find a directly stated objective to make sure, again, that that line of reasoning went all the way through, and in fact all the way up to the background information. And it was by looking backwards through it that you can more easily identify gaps in the information that's missing, and in particular when you are writing an abstract, because it's only 400 words long, it's a limited amount of spaces, even character spaces now, and information tends to get lost sometimes. So we have a follow-up handout that's a summary of this talk. Actually, 2 follow-up handouts that are a summary of the talk. One is the format, not only of the report of original research, but of the review article and the structure review and the case series and the case presentation, other types of articles you write with a reading list. And in the other handout, I called this concept of working backwards through it, I was just being tongue-in-cheek. I called it Casella's test of reasoning, right? It was my joke, Casella's test of reasoning. And one faculty did me great honor. He sent me a manuscript to review, and he asked me to be sure that I did Casella's retrograde test of reasoning. And I thought, oh, cool, retrograde, you know, space, NASA space program. But essentially that's the idea. It's to retrograde, to work backwards through it. You can, even though we did the report of original research here, you can apply this general concept to the other types of articles you'd write. So make a diagram, put the sections of them in there. You can create this diagram based on deconstructing an article and then creating this outline and then applying it to your information.